Hey there, it's Pastor Rob here. This upcoming Sunday, we're going to be looking at Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 9. I want to take us through this passage, and what I'm going to do over the next few minutes is just walk with you through this text. I've looked at it kind of briefly, but I haven't done a whole lot to prepare this. And so what you're going to see is really just us studying the Bible together. And I'm hoping that as we go through this, you'll learn some things, I'll learn some things, and we'll not only learn about the Ephesians text, but we'll also maybe pay attention to how is it that we study the Bible. And so you'll get to join me as we do this first read through of this text. I'm going to put my screen up so that you can actually see what it is that we're looking at. Now you can see that I've got the text right here in front of me. And let's start. One of the things that we're always looking to do is looking for how is a text laid out? What is the structure of the text? And maybe even before we get to that, we've got to look at the background. So we know we're looking at Ephesians 6, verses 1 through 9. And this is actually part of what was called a household code, which is, there were patterns of this in the New Testament times. And that's when a person, maybe it was a teacher or a philosopher or someone, would give instructions on how a household of husband, wife, slaves, children were all to conduct themselves. And so there's precedent for this outside of the Bible. Paul is not inventing something new. He's in Ephesians 6, we're in the middle of that larger section in which he's talking to both husbands and wives, and now he's going to be moving on to children and to servants. And that's that was a fairly well-known form of writing in New Testament times. Now, Paul begins here. You'll notice that he starts by addressing children, and he gives them a command. Now, what I've noticed here, when he uses the word obey, it's not the same word that Paul uses when he's speaking to wives. When he tells wives to submit, he's using a different word. Now, I bring that up because I think sometimes when we hear the word submit, we assume that it's really the same thing as obey. And it turns out that that's not really the case. There's something different between obedience, the obedience that a child would have to render to his or her parents, and the submission that Paul instructs wives to offer to their husbands. There's a lot more we could say about that, but I'm just drawing that out as a note that Paul chooses a different word here when the relationship is not a relationship of equals. So children and parents, there's a hierarchy there, and so the word is different. And in Ephesians, in Ephesians 5, the idea of submission does not imply hierarchy. It doesn't imply levels or importance or anything of that sort. So it gives the instruction, obey your parents in the Lord, honor your father and mother. Now, of course, this is from Exodus 20 or Deuteronomy 5. And we notice that he's quoting, this would be a quote of the Old Testament, and he acknowledges that here. It's the first commandment with the promise, and then he restates that promise down here. So he's quoting, once again, he's referring to that quote from Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5. So we have to ask, well, what does it mean that it will go well with you in the land? What does it mean that you may live long in the land? There's different interpretations. You know, when you read that this is a commandment with a promise that it will go well with you and live long, of course, the question is, well, there's lots of children who do obey. There's lots of families where there is obedience, and yet, you know, it doesn't always work out going well, right? So we have to grapple with that a little bit. We have to understand that promises like this are not always absolute. It's not always a guarantee that, you know, if you obey your parents, then you're guaranteed to have a good life and a long life. But it is a general principle. Generally speaking, communities and societies flourish when the family structure is strong and healthy. It's not a guarantee every time, but it is a general principle that does hold true. So that's the first section Paul is addressing here. He's addressing children. That's this whole section here. He's explaining to children that they have a role in the family, and that role is both obedience and honor. These are this just occurs to me here. These are two different words. Obedience is something we're called to do, but also honor. What we'll have to sort out, and we'll have to, we're not going to be able to untangle all of that here, but we're going to have to ask the question, what is, number one, what's the difference between obedience and honor? Sometimes obedience is most certainly called for, right? Children, especially young children, are called to obey their parents. There's not, it's not a democracy in the home. But honor is different. Honoring your parents is different, and it might be obedience, but it might not be obedience. As you get older, and especially as if you get married and have your own family, your parents grow older. What is, we're left asking that question. What does it mean for me to honor my mom or my dad as, they become elderly and cope with dementia? How do I honor that? We ask the question, what about in a family that's not healthy? What about in a family where the boundaries aren't always so well defined? How do you honor your mom or your dad or your parent when they're making unreasonable demands of you? Those are all questions that are going to kind of fall under this, and I'm raising them now because I'm intending and hoping to maybe go a little deeper, but at this point we're just asking that question. The second person or group of people that Paul addresses is fathers. And it's a shorter section, but what's interesting is that Paul actually addresses them at all. So if this larger section, we'll color it blue, if this larger section is the home, it speaks to children, and then normally you would just expect instruction being given to the children. The children would just be told that they need to obey their parents. But Paul does add a specific instruction for parents, or for fathers, I should say. And that's worth noting, because fathers ordinarily wouldn't be given instruction. They were given quite a bit of latitude in terms of how do they discipline their children. They could beat their children, they could ostracize them, they could expel them from the home. And that was all socially acceptable in many cases. And so the fact that Paul is actually addressing fathers right away sort of raises our curiosity about that. That's an interesting thing. We're going to, just for the sake of consistency, I always like to kind of highlight or point out words that are repeated. And so I just do that here. Paul speaks to children. Fathers, we've already noted. We see that word here and then again here. But you see that fathers, and Paul doesn't speak specifically to mothers here, but I suspect that that would be included, right? Because he's speaking to parents, but fathers perhaps more specifically, because if they are, as Paul said earlier, the head of the household, then they bear special responsibility. And one of the things that they're called to be responsible for is that they do not provoke their children to anger. Those are, for some fathers, those are going to be hard and convicting words, because if you're like me, you have those moments where you get frustrated with your kids and they're not always maybe listening or doing what you want them to do, and you tend to react strongly. And so Paul's words here are actually a pretty sobering message, that we are to not do things to provoke them to anger. Now, there's always a fine line, right? We're going to raise a question about that, because sometimes even the best discipline will make our kids angry. So how do we know the difference between legitimate discipline that might make them angry, and how do we know what is crossing a line and provoking needlessly to anger? And so again, I'm gonna guess that the answer to that question lies with that word there. We're going to ask, what does that word provoke mean? Now you'll notice it's a contrast here, so that actually helps us to get a little bit of sense of how we might do this. So where it says, oops, let me erase that line. Where it says, do not, oops, make sure we have the pen here. Do not do this, but do this. So provoking to anger is a contrast with bringing them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So there's kind of two different things. One of them would be, they're kind of opposite things. So disciplining and instructing in the Lord is the opposite of provoking to anger. We'll have to look a little more into what that actually looks like. I did notice something else just as I was saying that. The repetition of this idea of the Lord or in the Lord, this is now the second time that we've seen that. And so children are to obey their parents in the Lord. Parents are to instruct their children in the Lord. So there's this relationship between God and people, right? And so children, parents, I guess you might say, there's this relationship that God sees, that parenting and family is all done in the Lord. We see it again down here where Paul, we haven't got there yet, but Paul is addressing bondservants and he's talking to slaves or servants, and he's telling them that there's somehow a relationship between their role and their responsibility and the Lord. And so again, we'll have to ask, well, what does that actually look like? And we don't know that quite yet, but we'll get there. All right, I'm running out of colors here, but that's okay. The word bondservants is the next section, and we'll maybe make this kind of purple here. Bondservants. That's an important word. Some English translations choose the word slave, and I think that's unfortunate because when we think of slave, the NIV I know does it. When we think of the word slave, we think of the Atlantic slave trade, and we might think of even modern day like sex trafficking as modern forms of slavery. And so when you hear that, you come away with the idea that, Paul is somehow at least tacitly endorsing slavery. And that's an understandable conclusion, but I think it's inaccurate because it's based on a misunderstanding of what it meant to be a bondservant. Bondservants, now, it wasn't always a good thing, right? A master could mistreat his or her bondservant, but often bondservant to be a bondservant was pretty common. I think I want to say the number was upwards of 30% of the population was, I could be mistaken on that, but I seem to remember that up to that many people in New Testament times were bondservants. And so so it was a pretty common thing. Bondservants were usually, it was a way of working off a debt. Oftentimes bondservants went into servitude freely and willingly. And they, even when they had the option to buy their freedom, sometimes they wouldn't even do that because there were certain benefits or certain provisions that they received for being a bondservant that they would not have otherwise been privy to. So we want to just acknowledge that there's a misunderstanding there. I think that's always good to point out, because we can easily misunderstand that. But you'll notice what he's saying. He's saying, once again, he's coming back to that idea of obey. Since we circled the first one, well, there's the first word, obey. And now he's coming back and he's saying, once again, we have to obey your earthly masters as you would Christ, with fear and trembling. So there's a sense in which Paul is commanding and instructing reverence for those who have authority over us. I think today, by the way, I should have mentioned this a minute ago, probably the closest comparison would be your employer that Paul is speaking to. How do you engage your employer if you work for somebody else? What does that look like for you? Should you respect them? Should you do what they say all the time? Do you have the right to protest and those kinds of things? And I think Paul is answering that question here. And he's saying, obey as you would Christ. In other words, Paul is suggesting to us that the way that we do our work is a way that we are actually honoring Christ. So we ought to be treating our work as service to Christ himself. And I love how he chooses a couple of things here. He uses a couple of illustrations. He uses eye service and people pleasers. Eye service it's not really an English word, but it was a Greek word. It's just a way of saying don't work just because you want to impress people. Don't just work to put on a show for other people. But remember that as a bondservant, so if you're a bondservant, you're really a bondservant of Christ. And so your real master is Christ. You ought to be going into your work and serving and doing the work in your workplace as if you were as if Jesus himself were the one giving you orders. And that's why he says down here, as to the Lord and not as to man. It's really a way of highlighting the fact that our work is done differently as Christians. Our work is done as a way of serving and honoring Christ as our master. All right, we've dug into the text a little bit. You've gotten a little sense of the background. I invite you to join our worship on Sunday, because you're gonna hear a message on this text. You'll get to hear exactly where do we go with a passage like this, and I hope you'll join me then. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.